Welcome everyone to the webinar today. A bright sunny day here in Norfolk, snow covered, but just very beautiful outside. So thank you so much for tuning in today. I'm Ann Havemeyer, the director of the Norfolk Library, which you can see behind me. And it is my pleasure today to talk about the architect Alfredo Taylor and his work in Norfolk. Taylor came to Norfolk in the first years of the last century, and within a short period of time, he had put his distinctive mark on the Norfolk landscape, designing stone and timber houses, lakeside camps, commercial buildings, schools, churches, and monuments. His work, more than any other, has come to define the look and style of this small Connecticut town. In fact, those who have lived here for some time assume that everyone has heard of Alfredo Taylor. There he is in an iconic photo taken in the 1930s at a camp on Doolittle Lake. But even if you haven't heard of Alfredo Taylor, you need only drive through the center of Norfolk to make acquaintance with this highly original architect. Our town center is dominated by the tall brick building known as the Royal Arcanum, with its steeply pitched slate roof, enlivened with multiple gables and dormers. The building features patterned red and green brickwork, green faience tiles, and once had a fanciful tower pictured in this period postcard. Indeed, the Royal Arcanum gave the center of Norfolk a distinctive presence, a silhouette, which calls to mind the English architect Norman Shaw's Tower House in the London suburb Bedford Park, a far cry from a small village in northwest Connecticut. A year later, Alfredo designed yet another novel building in the center of town, this time in a Spanish vein with a red tile roof. The style once again takes us far from the northwest corner of Connecticut to the American Southwest and the architecture of the California missions. This is a photo of the building when it housed the Norfolk hardware store, and you can see the colorful handmade art tiles embedded in the brickwork. Sadly, the building burned down in 1987. The addition of Taylor's two buildings transformed the town center from a rather forlorn presence, as you can see in the top photo taken in 1878, to what you see on the bottom right, with poplars and maple trees lining the sidewalk. Station Place now presented a bucolic setting to the visitor arriving at the newly constructed railroad station in the center in the early 20th century. At the western entrance to town, Alfredo also made his mark when the local Catholic congregation, made up at the time almost entirely of people of Irish descent, decided to enlarge their undistinguished little wooden box of a church, pictured on the right. They called upon Alfredo, who gave the mystified parishioners a church that looked like it had been built centuries earlier. Alfredo's use of rough cast stucco walls emerging from rubble stone below suggests a layered history, as if the church had grown over the centuries, and speaks to the medieval heritage of Catholicism. When you are driving into Norfolk from the west, it is hard to miss this church, sitting near the World War I Soldiers Memorial that Alfredo also designed. The church is now an entirely different shade, a shade of pink, from the architect's intent, and the open belfry tower has been closed. At the time of construction in 1924, the color was described as burnt sienna and yellow ochre, recalling the Italian campaniles of Tuscany, where Alfredo was born and frequently sojourned. So diverse are Alfredo's designs, each imbued with its own particular charm, and so omnipresent in a single small community that the architect has become somewhat of a legend in Norfolk, where his work was recognized on the National Register of Historic Places in 1982 as the Alfredo Taylor Thematic District, comprising no less than 45 works in Norfolk and counting. This is a photo of Taylor taken in 1929 from his Harvard reunion book. And note the description, style, in every line. Here's a bit of background on the architect. Alfredo was born in Florence, Italy in 1872 of an American mother and an English father. The top image is from the 1880 New York census, which shows the family, and Alfredo at the bottom, 8 years old, born in Italy. His distinctive name, Alfredo Samuel Guido Taylor, in part derives from the country of his birth. Guido was given in honor of the great Italian painter Guido Reni. Pictured at the bottom is his ceiling fresco masterpiece, Aurora, painted in Rome in 1614. Alfredo's family lived in New York, and he attended the St. Paul's School in Concord, New Hampshire, pictured at the top, and Harvard College, where Seaver Hall had recently been completed, designed by the great 19th century architect Henry Hobson Richardson, and where Alfredo's interest in architecture likely began. He graduated with the class of 1894, and soon after enrolled in Columbia's School of Architecture. The image at the top left is of Columbia when it was located in Midtown Manhattan, and later on the lower right when it was under construction at Morningside Heights. That campus was being built while Taylor was a student and likely made a profound impression upon him. While at Columbia, he met Amelia Scranton, known as Minna. In 1896, Alfredo and Minna were married at the Brick Church in New York by the Reverend Henry Van Dyke. On the left is a picture of the Brick Church when it stood on Fifth Avenue at 37th Street. Henry Van Dyke was a summer resident of Norfolk and perhaps introduced the young couple to the town. Several years would pass, however, before they found their way to Connecticut. Young men interested in art and architecture at the end of the 19th century often did a course at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, pictured here. Taylor applied and was accepted. After graduating from Columbia in 1897, he and Minna left for Paris, where they spent the next 5 years. This amusing caricature of Alfredo was drawn by one of his classmates at the École. The French understood the attraction that young men and women had for Paris, and so instituted the rule that upon reaching a 30th birthday, students had to leave the École. 1902 was the year of Taylor's 30th birthday, so he and Minna headed home. This is where the legend of Alfredo Taylor and Norfolk begins. Taylor and his wife came to Norfolk as summer visitors, arriving at the train station pictured here, as did countless others in the early 1900s. They had rented a cottage on Litchfield Road. It was a fortuitous moment for the architect to discover Norfolk, for the town had become a fashionable summer resort in the 1890s, famed for its healthy air and mountain spring water, and it was now in the midst of a residential building boom. There were large hotels like the Hillhurst, pictured here, hotels that are no longer standing, that must have made Norfolk seem something of a bustling metropolis in those summer days. Revenues from all this activity were sensibly invested by town leaders who created a new and up-to-the-minute infrastructure. By 1900, Norfolk was one of the rare small towns in America that had electricity, a telephone, a central water line, and a sewer system. Many of the visitors decided to build a summer residence. Minna Taylor's mother, Amelia Scranton Fassett, was one of those visitors. She and her husband, pictured here, purchased a parcel of land and became among the very first to take advantage of the modern technologies Norfolk had to offer. She asked her son-in-law, Alfredo, to design and oversee the construction of a house that she would call Moss Hill, pictured on the right. Within a year, Alfredo and Minna were building their own home next door. The rugged beauty of the Norfolk hills undoubtedly called to mind the alpine landscape for them, for they named their home Rubley after Mount Rubley in the Swiss Alps, a place they had visited during their travels abroad. There quickly followed more commissions, and Taylor soon divided his time between Norfolk and New York, where he had formed a partnership with Julian Levy. Taylor had met Levy, also a Columbia graduate, when they were students at the École. In 1907, they established the architectural firm Taylor and Levy in the office pictured here. The two architects were extremely close friends, but appear to have lived very different lives. While Taylor loved small village life, spending the better part of each week throughout the year in Norfolk, Levy was a cosmopolitan New Yorker, immersed in its cultural life. He was variously president of the Architectural League, vice president of the New York chapter of the AIA, president of the Society of Beaux-Arts Architects, and was a trustee and major donor at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. The firm Taylor and Levy built a number of houses in and around New York, especially in New Jersey and Westchester County, one of which, the Alfred Cook residence in Mount Kisco, is pictured here. Levy was in charge of most of these projects. The Cook residence has a certain air of palatial majesty about it, but in spite of its grandeur, it lacks personality. It is a fairly typical Georgian Revival house. Contrast that with Taylor's Norfolk houses. One of the most striking features of the four houses that Alfredo designed within the first decade of his arrival in Norfolk is how different they are. Each has a distinctive personality. Although Taylor enjoyed using a particular vocabulary of materials, rugged granite, smooth stucco, terracotta tile, rubble stone, each of his houses is given a distinctive presence of its own. And we wonder to what extent each of these houses is a reflection of that person who lived in. This brings us to Alfredo's clientele, which was at that time almost entirely female. He did not exclude commissions from men. In fact, Taylor's earliest Norfolk commission, even before he built his own house, was from Professor Henry Todd of Columbia College for a summer residence which he named Brocklebank, pictured here. No less than 6 Columbia professors summered in Norfolk at that time, providing lucrative contacts for the young architect. Taylor would later design a pavilion for Dr. Frederick Dennis on his property, now Dennis Hill State Park. With thick granite walls, a massive chimney, and a varied roofline reflecting the surrounding hills, the Hilltop Pavilion provided a comfortable setting to enjoy the extensive views in all directions. But back to Taylor's female clientele in that first decade. We might call them the ladies of Litchfield Road, for their houses lined that north-south thoroughfare into town and were visible when they were built, unlike now. The first design was for Moss Hill, pictured on the upper left, for his mother-in-law, Mrs. Fassett. There followed in quick succession houses for, going clockwise, the widowed Mrs. Haddock, the powerful Mrs. Jenkins, and the suffragette, Miss Farnham. To what extent do these picturesque houses express the personalities of these women? To answer this question, we must briefly delve into the theory of picturesque design. This is what Alfredo learned at the École, where architects were trained to use a variety of picturesque styles in the design of fashionable residences. Picturesque theory was first formulated in the 18th century English landscape garden, which lost the rigid formality of 17th century French gardens and was designed to resemble wild, untouched nature. Note the difference between Lenotre's garden at Versailles, pictured at the top, and Capability Brown's garden at Stowe. When applied to architecture, picturesque theory brought a new vitality of design, enabling the colonial house to break out of its classical white box and express the growing diversity of American society. A comparison of these two Norfolk houses illustrates this development. The colonial house on the left was built as a tavern in 1794. Its classical design is based upon order, regularity, and symmetry, with matching sets of windows on either side of a central door and a neat roofline capped with a center chimney. The house on the right was built about 1890, and its picturesque design is characterized by irregularity and variety. Sometimes the windows are single or placed in groups of twos or threes. The roofline is interrupted by gables. The wraparound porch draws the eye away from the center of the house to the corner, and a terrace is set into the second floor. All this creates a lively sense of visual movement. Picturesque design was introduced in this country by Andrew Jackson Downing, a landscape gardener from Newburgh, New York. He landscaped local estates along the Hudson River and wrote several books about horticulture and landscape design, which included designs for picturesque houses. Downing's books were extremely popular and brought the author international renown before his untimely death at the age of 37 in a steamboat fire on the Hudson River. In these books, full of drawings, floor plans, and friendly advice, Downing introduced a new type of house to Americans, the picturesque country villa. According to Downing, a picturesque house should not be based on a fixed system of order and proportion, as a classical house was, but should grow freely in response to its natural setting. Take, for example, his design for a river villa. Downing matches the steep roof, high tower, and varied outline of the villa with the rugged scenery of the Hudson River Valley. In addition, Downing felt that when we look at a house, we should sense, quote, the whole private life of man, his intelligence, his feelings, and his enjoyments, unquote. In short, a house should express the character and lifestyle of its owner. Let's test Downing's theory with one of the most picturesque villas of the later 19th century to see if it matches the legendary personality of its owner, Mark Twain. Built in Hartford in 1874, the Mark Twain house is indeed as colorful, elaborate, and bold in design as its owner was feisty, impulsive, and irreverent. There are a variety of steep gables, projecting porches, and a third-floor terrace which juts out of and cuts into the roof. The house is colorful, with multicolored slate tiles on the roof and a variety of black and orange bands of brick. Porches, terraces, and balconies resonate with their own patterns of decorative stickwork, adding to the visual display. Chimneys rise to different heights and change angles. Windows follow no particular pattern. The tops of 3 small windows peek out from above the front porch, as if in surprise. There is no apparent logic to their placement there. Mark Twain called his house bewitching. In Hartford, it was said to be neither mid-Elizabethan, mid-Victorian, but wholly and absolutely Mark Twain. No one had ever seen anything like it before, nor thought they ever would again. For some, the house evoked a Mississippi River steamboat with its decorative stickwork like railings, its chimneys, smokestacks, its third floor porch, a pilot house, its veranda, a ship's deck, and the house poised to set sail. Although there is no verification of such intent, surely the constant activity and abrupt movement in this highly decorative design suggests the exuberant personality and lively and exaggerated wit of this famous author. The personalities of our Norfolk ladies are not as well documented as is that of Mark Twain, but it is interesting to surmise, based on the information we do have, how they are reflected in the houses Alfredo designed for them. I'll begin with his mother-in-law. Amelia Scranton Fassett was a formidable woman, 3 times married, and all evidence suggests that she was always certain about what she wanted. She had a very close relationship with her daughter, Minna, and seems to always have been present, sharing the Taylor's apartment in Paris while Alfredo was at the École, renting a summer cottage in Norfolk when the Taylors did, and building there when they decided to build. She and her second husband, Major John Barclay Fassett, lived in New York, and before building their house in Norfolk, they had a summer home in Norwalk. It had been in Amelia's family, and it was called Moss Hill. Moss Hill in Norwalk was a rather forbidding-looking house with a prominent French roof, one that Downing would have said evoked a feeling of power and force of character. The house calls to mind another house, this one out of the Alfred Hitchcock thriller Psycho, pictured right. It was chosen for the home of Anthony Perkins and his dead but clearly still domineering mother. Whether or not Amelia was a domineering mother, it is evident that the old family home had deep meaning for her, for when she built her house in Norfolk, she called it Moss Hill. Rising 3 stories with tall gables and bands of windows on all sides, Moss Hill in Norfolk takes full advantage of its elevated site. The house incorporates features Taylor would use in many subsequent designs. But overall, with its steeply pitched gables and decorative half timbering, the house recalls English design, specifically Tudor Revival. It is unlikely that it was Amelia Fassett who did this design, but it was definitely her who suggested that the house have elements of English design, for she was a frequent traveler to the English countryside, and so Alfredo probably followed her orders. Shortly after it was built, Moss Hill was cited in a book written in 1909 by architect Amar Embury entitled 100 Country Houses, Modern American Examples. The book featured country houses categorized according to a variety of styles, including Spanish, Elizabethan, Italian, and Japanesque. In his introduction, Embury wrote that modern architecture should not be an archaeological copy of the original, but should be governed by, quote, the expression of the program and setting. And he wrote, a client inevitably desires his own personality expressed by his house, and the architect is unable to entirely eliminate his. Embury compared Moss Hill at the top to the work of Edwin Lutyens, the English architect, whose house Great Dixter is pictured at the bottom of the slide. Lutyens reinterpreted the Tudor vernacular, achieving a sense of color through the use of varied building materials: stone, brick, tile, timber, plaster, and leaded glass. Like Lutyens, Taylor used the variety and natural color of materials to great effect, and it's too bad that we don't have a color photo of the house after it was built. Its slate roof, rose gray hand-cut granite piers rising through 2 stories, the woodwork painted red, contrasting with the white stucco. Embury described the design as unusual and modern in its treatment of materials. Just how modern was Amelia Scranton Fassett? We know that she was active in the women's suffrage movement. Here she is pictured at the far right, sitting on the porch in this photograph of a group of suffragettes in Winstead. And here she is among a group of climbers, so to speak, on Mont Blanc with her daughter, Minna. This cabinet photo was taken by Joseph Tyrez, a family of guides catering to the growing tourist boom in the Swiss Alps. One would like to imagine that Amelia and Minna, both prominent advocates of women's suffrage, saw themselves following in the footsteps of Marie Paradis, the first woman to climb Mont Blanc in 1808, or Henriette d'Angeville, who wore men's clothing on her much publicized 1838 ascent. Of course, worlds separated those dauntless adventurers from Amelia's group, which included not only the two women, but also their dog, Piccino. In any case, Amelia was clearly a woman with strong views, well matched to her lofty, lofty residence. In the early years of the 20th century, the Norfolk hills were only lightly wooded, having been cleared for the charcoal industry. Therefore, both Moss Hill and Rubley had magnificent views west to the Berkshire Hills, as well as clear views of each other. And as lofty as Moss Hill might be, Amelia Fassett's home still sits below that of her daughter and son-in-law, and it is Rubley that commands the hillside. Not only that, the two houses could not be more different in appearance. With its imposing rubble stone walls from which stone chimneys emerge to soar above the roofline, Rubley takes on the grandeur of its setting. In contrast to the English flavor of Moss Hill, Rubley calls to mind the architectural heritage of the Taylors' beloved Italy, Alfredo's birthplace, and the country to which the couple would return throughout their lives. Here is a closer view of Taylor's refined handling of his favorite building materials, rubble stone, contrasting with smooth stucco surfaces, and the decorative woodwork below the second floor oriel windows and on the balconies. The Taylors loved their Norfolk home. Family albums are full of photographs, mostly of the house, from the time of its construction. Along with the house, these photographs almost always feature the Taylors' dogs. There are photographs of the dogs doing tricks, sitting in a chair for tea on the porch, posing on the sofa. The Taylors had no children, but they raised spaniels and terriers, 64 in all. Family members recollect that the Taylors affectionately referred to the hill behind Rubley as Mount Everest, and that they loved to slide down the hill. There are those dogs again. In a postcard, Minna Taylor wrote to her mother in November of 1909, "It snowed so heavily yesterday and last night that today everything is as it would be in January. I am not coasting, but I'm just crazy to." I doubt there was any coasting for the widowed Mrs. Haddock, even though her house did resemble a chalet in the Swiss Alps. Mrs. Haddock and her daughter Kate had been summer visitors to Norfolk before they moved here full-time from Brooklyn and built this house on Litchfield Road. Both Mrs. Haddock's husband and son had died tragically, and her daughter Kate suffered scarlet fever as a child, which stunted her growth. She was only 4 feet tall. However, this did not result in a private, reclusive lifestyle. Rather, the gregarious Haddocks were well known about Norfolk and so conversant with the goings-on that they were endearingly immortalized as one of 3 means of communication in Norfolk: telephone, telegraph, and telehaddock. Even more vivid descriptions bring this pair, pictured at the bottom right, to life. quote, "The good ladies were unique in their manner of dress. They always wore impressive hats, and their dresses, which were made for them in Norfolk, were of silk or satin. Mrs. Haddock always wore purple, while her daughter always wore pink. They wore what was apparently all their jewelry all the time." Their house makes an equally emphatic statement. A broad gabled roof deeply overhangs and encompasses the entire body of the house, from which second floor wings emerge like arms over porches. Bands of diamond-paned windows and wooden balconies are applied like surface decoration to this solidly geometric form. The balconies, with their flat patterned woodwork, give the house the feeling of a Swiss chalet. Downing had suggested the Swiss model as appropriate for rugged mountainous sites, and like the Taylors, Mrs. Haddock clearly loved the Alpine association, for she called her house the chalet. The house that Taylor built for the powerful Mrs. Jenkins does not merely suggest a mountainous site by association, as did the chalet. It tackles it head on. Aptly named Hillside, it is sited dramatically on a steep slope facing north. Emphasizing the rugged terrain, the house is buttressed by severe granite walls and dominated by an expansive roof. Helen Hartley Jenkins first summered in Norfolk in 1898 with her daughters, Helen and Grace, and her father, Marcellus Hartley, a wealthy industrialist who made his fortune in the arms business during the Civil War. Hartley traveled in the same circles as Morgan, Gould, Rockefeller, and Carnegie. In fact, it was at Carnegie's castle in Scotland that Helen met her future husband, George Walker Jenkins, a lawyer who became president of the family-owned Remington Arms Company. The marriage was not a successful one, and George Jenkins does not appear to have figured largely in her life when she built her house in Norfolk. Helen Hartley Jenkins and her family were noted philanthropists and well-known benefactors of Columbia College, including the building of Hartley Hall Dormitory, the endowment of a school of nursing at Columbia Teachers College, and the construction of this memorial entrance gate to Barnard College in memory of her daughter. Helen was active in New York politics and as a member of the Prison Commission for the state of New York, involved in prison reform work. It is recorded that she provided newly released prisoners with a place to stay in the basement of her New York home until they established themselves elsewhere. Although her philanthropic activities are well documented, it is in the family's personal reminiscences that one begins to get a feeling for the forceful personality of this powerful woman. It was evident at an early age. Her daughter, Grace Mead, recalled, "My mother was a great rider. She rode side saddle entirely. When she was very young, she went to Mr. Durland's stable on the west side of New York. Mr. Durland would get his horses unbroken from the west. She would go down to the stable and break his horses." Her close friend, Virginia Gildersleeve, president of Barnard College, described her as, quote, "something of an enfant terrible, her tongue afire with the energy of her thoughts. She could frighten some people witless. No one ever found her dull." Helen Mead Platt remembered her grandmother as very powerful and very opinionated. The dramatic Jenkins bungalow in Norfolk certainly matches the forceful personality of this powerful woman. One approaches the house from the rear, where the roof extends down to within a few feet of the ground, as is evident in this wash drawing by Taylor in the archives of Columbia's Avery Library. On the north side, however, there is a dramatic drop-off as the house rises 3 stories from grade, its rubble stone walls fortified with cut granite buttresses. There is an interesting personal element reflected in the design of the house as well. Family tradition recalls that the house was designed to resemble a Serbian country house, with balconies inside and out, and the gables originally decorated with murals. The murals were painted by William de Leftwich Dodge directly on the stucco. Dodge was one of the most prominent muralists of the era, at a time when murals were regarded as an essential element of most public architecture, theaters, municipal buildings, and some private homes. Dodge's important work includes murals for the Thomas Jefferson Building of the Library of Congress, Washington, D.C., circa 1895, murals for the state capitol at Albany, and a number of hotels and theaters. The murals on the Jenkins bungalow featured cows and milkmaids, peasant designs, Slavic in character. Why Slavic in character? For the answer, we turn to Helen Hartley Jenkins' close friendship with another Norfolk summer resident, Professor Michael Pupin, with whom she took a motor tour through Bohemia and Serbia in 1909, just as her house was being built. Pupin was a native of Serbia and a physics professor at Columbia University. He came to this country a penniless immigrant at the age of 16. While working on farms and in factories, he learned English, went to Columbia, studied mathematical physics and physical chemistry at Cambridge and Berlin, received his doctorate in 1889, and returned to Columbia to teach in the new Department of Electrical Engineering. Studying electrical charges, he developed the Pupin coil, which, when spaced properly along telephone circuits, enabled long-distance telephoning. He sold it to AT&T for $1 million. His memoir, From Immigrant to Inventor, published in 1923, won the Pulitzer Prize in Letters. In 1897, Pupin bought property in Norfolk, which he named Hemlock Hill Farm, and in 1907 built the house which stands there today to evoke a country estate in his native Serbia. On the left is another view of Hemlock Hill, and on the right is an old Serbian farmhouse, and you can see the use of stone in each and the varied roof lines. Helen Hartley Jenkins also wanted her Norfolk house to suggest a Serbian country home, and pictured here is an example of a Moravian house in Serbia with a second-floor balcony similar to the Jenkins balconies. For Elizabeth Farnham, there were no Serbian villas nor Swiss chalets. Miss Farnham's summer residence has a decidedly modern feeling to it. The simplicity of design with its plain stucco surfaces, unadorned bands of windows, and broad gables at either end of the roof, punctuated only with eyebrow dormers, suggests the work of contemporary British architects, chief among them Charles Voysey. The Farnham house at the top bears a striking resemblance to Moorcraig at the bottom, designed by Voysey in 1898. Voysey was the most successful country house designer among a prominent group of British arts and crafts architects who sought to revive the decorative arts and hand craftsmanship. As we saw in the work of Edwin Lutyens, architects turned to the rural vernacular, using local materials, delighting in the texture of brickwork or stonework, featuring the simplicity and elegance of line and individuality of expression as opposed to the machine made. While educated at the École, Taylor was very much an arts and crafts architect. Similarities between Voysey and Taylor seen here include the use of rough cast stucco, windows arranged in horizontal bands, sweeping roof lines with horizontal emphasis, and the absence of decoration. They believed that all ornament should consist of the essential construction of the building. Similarities between the Farnham house and the work of Lutyens is evident at Folly Farm, designed in 1906, where the sweeping roof is supported on buttress arches at the far left, and the interplay of light and shadow creates such a visual interest in both houses. Again, the emphasis is on craftsmanship and the use of local materials. It is an old world made new. Boise's smaller country houses, described in Country Life magazine in 1899 as artistic and modest in price and character, were designed for a new breed of rural landowner. By commissioning such a house, patrons identified themselves with progressive and artistic ideals: simplicity, repose, craftsmanship, rejection of artifice, and lavish display. True to her house, pictured at the right, Elizabeth Farnham was one of Alfredo's most progressive clients. She was a member of the prominent Farnham family of New Haven, closely associated with Yale University, and grew up on Hill House Avenue in the home of her grandfather, Henry Farnham, a railroad tycoon. The house later became the home of various presidents of Yale University. Elizabeth's father died when she was just 13, and she was raised by her uncle, Henry Walcott Farnham, professor of political economics at Yale. In 1912, she was elected the county chairman of the Connecticut Suffrage League and held suffrage meetings at her residence. She is pictured in this photograph of members of the Connecticut Women's Suffrage League, as is Alfredo, one of the few male members. Elizabeth was very active in New Haven's civic life, a member of the City Board of Education, and as president of the Garden Club, a leader in the city beautification movement. It is interesting to note that in conjunction with her modern Norfolk house, she commissioned the landscape gardener, Marion Coffin, to design her gardens. The Farnham house is perhaps the only Taylor house to have been built in association with a landscape designer. And this brings us back to its ties with the work of contemporary British architects, who often worked in collaboration with landscape designers. Most notable was the partnership of Sir Edwin Lutyens and Gertrude Jekyll. Marion Coffin was a disciple of Gertrude Jekyll and a pioneer in the field of landscape architecture, receiving a degree from MIT in 1904, just 6 years before she designed the Farnham Gardens, pictured at the bottom left. She would go on to a lifelong professional association with Henry DuPont and design not only the DuPont Gardens at Winterthur, but also the grounds of the University of Delaware. Marion Coffin was a contemporary of another landscape designer, Beatrix Farrand, who lived in New Haven, landscaped the grounds at Yale, and with whom Elizabeth Farnham may well have been familiar. All of these associations would suggest that Elizabeth Farnham was eminently suited to her modern home. There are two more ladies for whom Alfredo worked, and they were anything but modern. Mary and Isabella Eldridge, members of Norfolk's ruling gentry. The Mrs. Eldridge, Mary we see at the left and Isabella at the right, were opposed to women's suffrage, unlike Elizabeth Farnham, Minna Taylor, Mrs. Fassett, and Alfredo himself. However, these doyens of Norfolk society were not to let the attention of Norfolk's appealing young architect escape them. And so Mary and Isabella commissioned Taylor to design and build what is arguably his masterpiece, the Norfolk Downs Shelter. The Norfolk Downs preceded the country club as the local golf course and was built for the recreation of townsfolk in 1897, a gift of the Eldridge sisters. Taylor used the architectural vocabulary he so loved: rubble stone walls, a massive chimney, hand-hewn timbers, and an enveloping roof. These materials evoked the rugged features of the Norfolk landscape and the need for shelter in the icebox of Connecticut. Indeed, the shelter has been described by Norfolk's own Brendan Gill as embodying the town's collective DNA. In 1915, Mary and Isabella turned to Taylor once again when they were in need of a garage. By this point, the classical revival had become the dominant style in the domestic architecture of America's wealthy. Answering this call, Taylor amusingly placed a classical entryway in the midst of his signature stone exterior, and, as if poking fun at classicism, added a sharply unharmonious chimney at left. I have also included here an image of an Oldsmobile Viking convertible, which is the same model driven by Taylor around town. Taylor is often described as zooming about in an open Cadillac, but in fact, this was the car he preferred. By 1915, most of Taylor's clients were men, and the architect adapted to the new classical revival style in his work, as seen in the Country Club of 1916. Yet the classical revival houses he designed do bear his distinctive signature. One might see a large fieldstone chimney, as in the Hartshorn house at the left, known as the Pines, built the same year as the Country Club, or the Noble House at right of 1919. Taylor seems to be saying, if his work could speak, that he would build in white painted clapboard, but watch out for the roofline. In the 1930s, Taylor's residential commissions dwindled as the country house market suffered during the Depression years. Most of Taylor's commissions were for smaller houses or alterations of existing houses. The house Taylor designed for Gerald Mulville is an example. It is unique in his use of white lime stained brick, the only brick house Taylor designed in Norfolk. But it is so appropriate, for Mulville was a masonry contractor. I will end this afternoon with a quick look at Alfredo's designs for several recreational structures where the romantic notions of his clients coincided with his own, and where he freely used the materials he loved: rubblestone walls, heavy slate roof, and small paned windows, seen here in a rustic retreat that he designed for Mrs. Starling Childs in 1929, and which she named the Hut. The next year, her husband asked Taylor to build a more complicated structure, the Sports House, with courts for badminton, fives, and squash. Here, the architect let his imagination run wild and designed a stone and timber building with tiny lead glass windows and a dovecote tower. The camps Alfredo designed on Doolittle Lake in Norfolk present a distinct variety within his rustic vocabulary of large boulders, hand-hewn timbers, rubblestone walls, and chimneys. Each of these camps has a unique presence, telling us something about its owner. The camp Taylor built for Grace Hartley Mead in 1935 has a fortress-like quality with its multiple gables building up to a pyramidal roof. Leaded glass windows and doors are deeply recessed into the thick rubblestone walls. The camp calls to mind the imposing Helen Hartley Jenkins house built for Grace's mother almost 20 years earlier. The Bremen camp is so simple in design, as simple as the Mead camp is elaborate. Dominated on the lakeside by a sloping roof, and on the land side by an enormous rubblestone chimney, the camp has a childlike scale. It is no wonder it was affectionately called the Playhouse. Roughly hewn clapboards and small diamond-paned windows add to the quaint character of this camp, which was built for the undoubtedly quaint Mrs. Irene and Emily Bremen. The Mrs. Bremen had summer residence on Laurel Way in Norfolk, and used the playhouse for entertaining friends at tea parties. The Bremen camp was accessible only by boat, and guests were rowed across Doolittle Lake from the clubhouse by the Bremen chauffeur. Cabana Bosque is the camp Taylor designed for Arthur and May Knox in 1927. Like the Bremens, the Knoxes lived on Laurel Way and envisioned their camp as a daytime retreat which would provide a complete escape and immersion into the natural surroundings and beauty of Doolittle Lake. What better way to escape the cares of everyday life than at a camp which had the flavor of those peasant cottages the Knoxes found so charming in the Basque region of Spain. With the last of the Doolittle camps, the best part of Taylor's work in Norfolk was brought to a close. After 1940, he seems to have been in active retirement, with the emphasis on active. He remained agile and fit, and was known to play tennis almost every day, even in the rain, followed by a plunge in the pool. His death was sudden, following an attack of indigestion on October 22, 1947, and it was reported in the local paper that he had made plans to play tennis that very afternoon. He was 74 years old. This iconic photograph of Alfredo was taken in 1936 by the renowned photographer Samuel Gaccio on the stairs of a camp he designed at Doolittle Lake. This is the Alfredo Taylor that Brendan Gill remembered when he wrote, "So diverse were Fredo's designs that, taken together, they might appear to have a touch of madness about them, as did Fredo himself at the time I knew him, a white-bearded, jaunty old man dressed in a loud houndstooth tweed jacket and white golf knickers, and racketing about town at top speed in a towering Cadillac into whose trunk he had dumped 1,000 pounds of sandbags weight that was to keep him from skidding when, on roads slick with ice and snow, he raced pell-mell back and forth from New York to Norfolk and back. But there was madness in neither the man nor his work. Joyously, he and his clients were engaged in testing the limits of their imaginations. Here, the structures still stand today, silent witnesses, public and private, to what a good time he and his clients had, sharing an architecture based not upon reason, but upon romance.